They expected a routine shakedown on a back road, a makeshift checkpoint, a few badges, and the easy arithmetic of fear. What none of them expected was the single slap that would ripple far beyond the dust and the headlights, an arrogant strike meant to humiliate a uniformed woman, and a mistake that would set a city into motion. The road is a stubborn line of grit and potholes that runs between two poor neighborhoods. It smells of diesel, frying oil, and the faint, sweet rot of overripe fruit. At dusk, urchins pull tarps down, and riders take the shortcut to the highway. Tonight, 3 men have made that shortcut into tax season. Inspector Bruno Valente leans against the hood of a cruiser with the casual arrogance of a man paid to bend rules. His swagger is loud even before he opens his mouth. His 2 companions, Sergio and Ricardo, move like trained echoes, eyes scanning the line, hands resting on holsters they don't need to brandish. The motorcycle that slows first is a small Honda Biz, the kind that has carried groceries, school books, and a family's hopes for years. An elderly woman with her hair pinned back sits on the back, her thin shoulders draped by a faded shawl. Her hands curl around the captain's waist in the kind of reflexive trust that comes from raising a child to stand tall in service to the country. The captain rides in front, Raquel Andrade. Her uniform is pressed, but the fine dust of the road clings to the boot leather. She is not looking for trouble. She is coming home. Bruno's grin spreads like grease. "Engine check," he calls, though there is no reason to. The request is a pretext. The extortion is the point. He steps close, pats the tank like he owns it. He asks for documents with a tone that implies nobody varies from the script. When Raquel presents her ID, the inspector runs an assessing sweep. Rank, insignia, polished shirt. He misses nothing. He sees the captain first as a bargaining chip. He does not see, because he is not looking, the lineage that ties her to the city. "You're lucky tonight," Bruno says, voice soft as oil. "We could take you in for a little confusion." He laughs. Sergio and Ricardo laugh too. They laugh because they know procedure, because they've done this before, and the night ends with a pocket litter full of notes and no one asking too many questions. Raquel's jaw tightens. She does not like this. She doesn't like being sized up like contraband. She is trained to move through threats and to make decisions in fraction of second slices. Tonight she chooses silence. The captain's hands stay on the bars. Sonia Andrade, her mother, sits behind, eyes darting. The old woman has the small folded dignity of someone who has sewn for 30 years and never thought the world would come to this. She clutches a plastic bag with a small bundle of provisions and a prescription folded like a secret. The exchange begins to tilt. Bruno's voice rises in mockery. He steps 1 inch too close. A hand moves like it owns permission. The slap cuts the air. It is loud enough to split the ordinary noises of the road. A raw sound, the crack of flesh, and the rustle of nylon. The light from a passing truck catches the red bloom on Raquel's cheek and holds it like a photograph. Shock isn't cinematic in the way movies make it. It arrives thin and precise, a tightening behind the ears, a slow bloom of heat. Raquel freezes, not from weakness, but because a soldier's reflex refuses to make a domestic spectacle out of discipline. Her mother gasps. There is a small animal sound from the motorcycle, the sound of something that knows recognition. This was not supposed to happen. Someone's phone hums 3 bikes behind. A young man in a college hoodie, Pedro, tilts his head, watches the scene unfold like everyone else, and when the hand falls, he does the honest thing that modern nights require. He lifts his phone and records. His footage is raw. It shakes with adrenaline. He zooms in and follows the timeline with the crude fidelity of a witness. Bruno's stare, the slap, the stunned face, Sonia clutching at air, and the captain's stillness. He posts before he thinks about consequences, because the consequence he fears is always being late to the next story. The policemen improvise a cover. They move to arrest Raquel for a supposed traffic offense, a forged narrative made of paper and performance. They bundle the mother briefly, more to humiliate than to help. They shove the captain toward the cruiser, as if sequence will erase transgression. Bruno's grin congeals into the satisfaction of one who has exerted dominion and expects praise. But cameras are patient prosecutors. Pedro's clip lives with a clarity that alibis cannot match. It travels, because across the city 1,000 people ride the same line of light and data at night. The clip jingles between messaging apps, a piece of heat that spreads along the arteries of the internet, landing on timelines and public groups. By the time the men get back to the station, the first murmurs exist beyond their reach. Inside the precinct, fluorescent lights throw odd shadows against concrete. The cells smell of old sweat and bleach. Raquel sits in a bench with her uniform still on, the red mark on her cheek a small, fierce promise. She says very little. Discipline is not reflexive bravado here. It is a ledger kept in silence.
Around her, the hum of fans and the intermittent bark of an intake desk phone create a suburban prison of routine. Sonia coughs in the corner, and then coughs again. This cough is different. It is the thin fret of asthma. The heat is a kind of cruelty. The cell is not meant for comfort. It is meant to compress. The old mother's breaths grow shorter. The old woman presses a hand to her throat, her face rearranged into an expression that cuts straight to what matters: survival. Raquel shifts to help.
She takes her mother's inhaler from a small bag and shakes it like it holds the last of a world. The inhaler is old. The valve stutters. Her fingers are steady, even when they shake. The officer on duty chooses not to react to a woman in need right away. There is an economy of indifference in the station that rewards those who control and punishes those who need. Outside, Pedro watches his phone's play count climb. The clip, 47 seconds, has become a small, sharp truth. He watches the comments multiply: disgust, outrage, anger. 1,000 strangers' empathy piles up like bricks. The clip hits a local activist's feed. She tags a journalist. The journalist tags a friend at a news desk. The ship of indignation that moves on a tide of clicks begins to swell. By the time a late-night patrol receives a call about a disturbance at the station, the internal clock of the city has already adjusted. People start to whisper a name: Andrade. It is a name that, in this city, carries weight. It carries a family history: a mother who sewed uniforms to send 2 daughters away to duty, 2 girls who learned to bow and then to lift their heads. One, Raquel, became a captain in the army. The other, Ana Carolina Andrade, rose like a slow, steady tide through precincts and paperwork to become the city's police chief, the kind of role that sits at the intersection of power and responsibility. Ana Carolina's office is a measured room of order. Stacks of reports lean like small buildings. A framed picture of the city hangs on the wall. She is a woman who has curated her pace. But tonight, a small vibration on her assistant's phone draws her eye. Lucas, junior clerk, and a man who reads tone the way some people read faces, taps twice and slides the screen across a corner of the desk. He thinks briefly about boundaries, then he presses play. The video is not cinematic. It is not polished. It is present and therefore unbearable. The slap is a punctuation that makes the rest of the world unnecessary. Ana Carolina's shoulders shift. For a moment, she is only a licensed officer seeing a badge misused. Then she recognizes the cheek, the way the uniform sits on that body, the old shawl at the back. The recognition is the kind of lightning that splits a tree. The world that until now has been the plain work of reports and meetings snaps into an axis of personal demand. She closes the laptop with a small, deliberate movement. The room seems suddenly too small for the weather outside. There is a private calculus in her face, professional duty mapped against a private stake. She was taught to let duty be the North Star. She learned to hold personal feeling in reserve for the court of decision. Yet in the quiet of her office, the sound of that slap is small enough to be private and vast enough to be political. Ana Carolina does not call for vengeance. That is not her way. She calls for procedure.
She taps a line to the Internal Affairs Unit, Corregedoria, and commands a locate on the officers involved. She texts General Alencar a brief, factual message about a soldier detained in municipal custody and requests military accompaniment for transport. She tells Lucas to get the original file from Pedro and preserve the chain of custody, preserve the phone file, the metadata, the geolocation. Her hands move with administrative speed, each step designed to make any lie brittle. But there is also a personal motion. She thinks of her mother, Sonia, sitting at a kitchen table in a small apartment across town. She thinks of Raquel as a child, round-cheeked and stubborn, the two of them in ragged uniforms, when sheep pride was all they could afford. In a cupboard, she can hear the sound of a tea kettle in memory, the sound of a back door closing, when the 2 girls left home for the first time to join institutions that demanded heart spines. There is anger. There is also calculation. As much as she wants the man who raised a hand to be stripped of rank on the spot, she understands that strangers' anger is not always the best instrument for justice. She wants the truth to be undeniable. She authorizes an immediate administrative investigation, and asks the internal affairs captain for photographic evidence, witness interviews, and the rapid seizure of the officers' phones. She makes one call to the Ministry of Public to notify them of potential criminal conduct and to ensure prosecutors will pay attention. She calls an old contact at the governor's office to inform them that a high-profile case could go public, if it hasn't already. The political machinery begins its quiet turning. Meanwhile, at the station, the world is quickening. The officer on duty pries open the cell door when Anna Karolina's name is invoked. Authority can be a key. Sonia's breathing has become a small, jagged thing, an emergency configured by the fumes of the station and the weakness of an old woman's lungs. They call for an ambulance. The ambulance siren becomes a new instrument in the soundtrack, a thin, high keening that winds between buildings. In the waiting room of a near hospital, fluorescent light bleeds into linoleum and cotton curtains. Nurses move with purposeful choreography. Raquel holds her mother's hand and watches monitors mark a body. Her posture is not theatrical. It is the steady vigil of a soldier turned daughter. Her uniform is folded on a nearby chair, as if time has given her the right to be both. At her back, the sound of Bruno's name mutters through news channels and social feeds, echoes of a story that refuses to sit in the dark. Anna Karolina arrives not with fireworks or show, but with a notebook and a calm that demands clarity. She moves through corridors with a map in her head and a list of actions. She sits by the bed, glances at the monitors, and then looks at her sister.
The two women exchange a look that compresses decades, the small ironies of childhood, the lunches shared with cheap stew, the nights when one filled in for the other when duty called. In that look there is no grand speech, only a shared recognition that family will be the engine of the next steps. Back at the precinct, Bruno and his companions are becoming smaller figures under the weight of public attention. The paperwork that had been meant to justify their actions stands naked before the raw, unedited blip. Even the bravado of accustomed men can be crushed by 1,000 eyes. The video is the kind of evidence that moves the crowd and the machinery at once. It is not perfect evidence in a court, but it is a seed of undeniable fact that aligns public instinct with institutional responsibility. Within hours, the clip has been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. The city's feeds are full of the same frame, a red handprint on a uniformed cheek. Comments pile up. Some demand quick retribution, others counsel patience. The singer on the radio asks, during an interview, whether the police force will tolerate such behavior. The governor's press office issues a short line, "We are monitoring." That line is a door that will then be walked through by the processes Anna Karolina has already begun. Across the city, conversations shift. For many, the slap is an old narrative, another example of how power slips into cruelty. For others, it is a remarkable moment, an army captain, one who swore to protect a nation, struck by someone who was supposed to embody public order. The public's sense of scandal grows when they learn who the captain is related to, the city's police chief. The irony is a current that pulls the story into national argument. The men who thought their badge sheltered them have misread the map. Anna Karolina's first steps are surgical. She asks for the original file from Pedro and for his formal witness statement. She ensures the chain of custody by having Lucas log the file and by assigning a prosecutor to the case who will not be easily swayed. She orders the immediate administrative suspension of Bruno pending preliminary investigation. She asks the internal affairs team to secure body-worn video from nearby patrols and to request surveillance footage from surrounding commerce cameras that might have caught the road stop. The aim is to create a lattice of corroboration. The goal is to make falsehood impossible. All of this unfolds under the strange light of a public that is both outraged and rapt. The machinery of accountability must move faster than rumor. The city's security apparatus responds. General Alencar offers military protocols to ensure Raquel's transfer and care. The Secretary of Security, Otavio Mendez, calls for a measured investigation. His phone call sounds to some like an attempt to control the narrative. Anna Karolina politely refuses humility. She demands responsibility. In the quiet personal rooms where the family waits by a bed, and in the narrow, carpeted offices where bureaucracy hums, tension doubles. The mother lies small and fragile, the monitors ticking like small protesters against death. Raquel wears an expression like a veteran soldier waiting for orders, precise, contained, plotting the next appropriate move. Anna Karolina maps the legal field as if drawing trenches. Who will be interviewed, the path for forensic analysis of phones, the list of institutional actors who must be informed to prevent cover-up. Outside, the clip circulates with fragments and commentary. Some replay the slap in slow motion, others freeze the frame on the flash of pain. The city begins to feel smaller, as if lines of power that once seemed impermeable now look porous under the scrutiny of an angry public. Bruno doesn't yet understand the scale of the mistake. He believes himself to be merely an inspector who took liberties. In his bars of bravado, he calls his wife and tries to position the narrative. He speaks of being at work, of harried civilians, of a misunderstanding that will be smoothed over. He does not know how quickly the city's institutions will close in. He does not know that the phone in the officer's desk drawer will contain messages that, when read properly, will read like a ledger of informal extortion. In that moment, Bruno is as fallible as the rest of us, confident yet blind. Power often breeds a shorthand for truth in those who wield it, and that shorthand is always dangerously incomplete. The station begins to quiet while the administrative wheels begin to turn. Anna Carolina remains in the hospital corridor a long time, the angle of light shifting from harsh hospital white to the oil-warm glow of late evening. She speaks in brief, exact sentences to reporters who gather at the edge of the property, careful to frame her words so they are useful to due process. "We will not tolerate misuse of authority," she says. The line is almost a script. It is also a promise. Her promise is not vengeful. It is procedural and precise, an appeal to the institutions she leads. There is an old photograph in her wallet of two small girls on a stoop, one balancing a grocery bag larger than her, the other proud in a thrifted cap. They used to hum songs their mother taught them when hands were idle and money was tight. They grew into uniforms and into different kinds of responsibility. Tonight, that shared history is a private map for action. It is also a boundary. She will not let family obscenely change the nature of her duty, nor will she let institutional silence protect criminals. As the city tips into night, Internal Affairs sends 2 agents to the station with sealed evidence bags and an investigative checklist that suggests the beginning of a long bureaucratic conversation. They interview guards, collect uniforms, log inventories, and press for the chain of custody on the 3 officers' phones.
The simple act of inventory becomes a weapon against denial. The men who until an hour ago were laughing on a roadside find their laughter receding in the face of recorded fact. At the same time, a prosecutor in the ministry begins to draft a motion for preliminary charges: misconduct, abuse of power, possibly assault. All legal moves are calibrated to stand in court, not only in the glare of transcripts, but under the microscope of a public that wants narrative clarity. Legal counsel review precedents and check the boxes that will make the case resilient to 2 kinds of threats: smear and silence. But institutional machinery is slow, and grief is immediate. Sonia's breathing remains fragile. Machines beep with patient rhythm. Raquel watches, her army training converting into domestic resilience. She is a woman who knows how to stand in the face of hazard, and now the hazard is made of hospital fluorescence and a beep-beep that means life clings on. Anna Carolina stays. She does paperwork. She signs affidavits and sits in interviews with the internal affairs officers, each signature another small iron in the lock of truth. As the first part of the city's story bends into the night, other actors shift into place. A local activist group begins to organize an online petition demanding transparency. A TV reporter, sensing the angle of family and institutional betrayal, starts to assemble interviews. Social media lights it up further. The clip passes from hand to hand and mouth to mouth, becoming fuel. None of this is neat. None of it is a final answer. The slowness of courts and the velocity of public outrage create a tension that will test the integrity of every institution involved. For now, the evidence is clear. The mother is fragile, and the sisters, one in uniform, one in an office, have put their private history on the table in service of a bigger truth. The city watches. The men who thought the night would pass as it always does are discovering that for the first time in a long time, the instruments of accountability are awake. Once more, the helmet of a motorcycle sits parked in an empty alley, dust settling like questions. The red mark on a uniform cheek will not fade quickly. The video loop hums like a taut string across the city's feeds. And somewhere, tucked into a small phone file, the metadata waits, impartial, sterile, and damning. The chain of custody is the hinge on which the rest will turn. If you care about accountability, hit like and subscribe. This story matters. The city takes a breath like a body braced for impact. Anna Carolina, who has made a life out of being precise when others panic, begins to widen the circle of who must be involved. She informs the prosecutor's office that there will be a request for expedited review. She asks the governor's office to allow public transparency as the case proceeds.
She coordinates with General Alencar to arrange for Raquel's transfer to a military hospital that can ensure her mother's needs are met and provide the kind of continuity the family requires. The sequence of events accelerates. Lucas brings Pedro into a small room to record a formal statement. The student's hands tremble when he hands over the original device. Pedro's eyes are bright with fear and purpose. He knows he's given something heavier than a clip. He's given testimony. He is also suddenly aware of the weight this will put on him. Interviews, subpoenas, the attention that does not ask consent. For a moment he glimpses the human cost of being a witness in a society where truth can be weaponized and where truth can also be life-saving. At midnight, as the hospital corridors dim into a hush of late-night tiredness, the first formal charges are drafted. A prosecutor signs a tentative indictment. The wording is careful: assault, abuse of authority, misuse of public office. The request for pretrial detention is considered. The legal machinery grinds into place, not as a monument to triumph, but as a methodical instrument designed to hold two things: the liability of the accused and the dignity of the victim. The men in custody begin to feel the change in the wind. Bruno receives his first real legal counsel, someone who tells him without frills that the days of slapping and shrugging off consequence are challengingly numbered. He sits in a small, dim interview room, and with a voice less confident than the swagger on the road, he asks whether he has done something wrong. The man across from him does not offer moralizing. The man offers pragmatic information. Evidence is being compiled. The city is watching. And yet the night refuses to be simply a moral geometry of points and counterpoints. In a small apartment on the city's edge, Sonia's old hands, which once hemmed soldiers' uniforms and smoothed shirts, tremble as she breathes. A nurse adjusts a mask and speaks in soft Portuguese-turned-English phrases of comfort. The sisters hold hands above plastic liners, and an old story of two girls who once shared a bowl of stew and a single blanket becomes, suddenly, an axis for the public good. This first set of movements is not resolution. It is the start of an investigation that will need evidence, courage, and the patience to let legal process do its work. There will be press rooms, political calculus, and the slow unfolding of discovery. But in this hour, the human details are what anchor the story. The red handprint, the shaky phone video, the mother's inhaler, the sister who will not let the pain be ignored. Outside, the city sleeps in pockets and wakes in others. The clip keeps looping on phone screens, even in the quietest apartments, and each replay shapes a new constellation of outrage.
The men who once assumed their badge gave them immunity are beginning to understand an older truth: that power's true test is not whether it can be seized for petty advantage, but whether it endures scrutiny. Tonight, it does not. The next moves are not yet visible. The prosecutor's office will pore over texts. The internal affairs team will cross-reference patrol logs. Friends and family of the accused will whisper defenses and calls for leniency. The city will watch, hungry for a demonstration that institutions can correct themselves. For Ana Carolina and Raquel, the story is already intimate and public at once. They inhabit the double life of private pain and civic responsibility. In the waiting room, the sisters watch a small loop of the video for the last time. The picture is nothing like how memory will keep the moment. Memory will prefer tenderness and the kitchen table, where their mother hums when she is tired. The video insists on line and clarity. It will be argued over in court and in editorial rooms. It will be the spine around which a larger conversation about abuse of power forms. As the night stretches toward the city's first hollow hours, ambulances pass with measured urgency. The internal affairs team files the first report. The prosecutor's office places a call to a judge. Ana Carolina signs another piece of paper, another step along a path not of vengeance, but of legal intervention. The case has been set spinning by a single human choice, a slap meant to dominate. It will now be answered by a larger constellation, a daughter in uniform who refuses humiliation, a sister in command who refuses silence, a mother caught between faint breaths and the database of a city that contains the raw evidence. The rest of the story, the trials, the political pressure, and the small domestic reconciliations, has yet to unfold. But the first act has bent conviction and procedure into a form that will be hard to ignore. And somewhere, beneath the gravity of proceedings and the glow of screens, a pot on a small stove waits, unremarkable, patient, for a family that will return, one day, to the ordinary art of making a meal together.
The ordinary, after all, is what the fight is for. The ability to come home without fear, to sit at a table and know one has been defended by the institutions sworn to keep order. For now, the city watches. The video keeps moving. The institutional gears, slow and sometimes resistant, have begun to turn. The next morning will bring a press conference, legal papers, and the first public naming of Operation Dignity. But night has its own reckonings. Small gestures of care, the gathering of evidence, and the unforeseen power of a stranger's phone to make a private wrong into a public obligation. Dawn comes thin and uncompromising the morning Ana Carolina steps onto the plaza. Cameras cluster like gulls. Cables are ropes that tie the city's attention to a single lectern.
The banner behind her reads Operation Dignity, a phrase chosen with the care of someone who knows law is rhetoric made visible. The crowd is a press mosaic, phone lights, microphones, faces hungry for an arc. Transgression, answer, consequence. She stands steady. Her voice cuts clean through the hum. She names the offense without grandstanding: assault, abuse of authority, misuse of office. She places the facts in a frame that cannot be ignored. There is a battered uniform, a mother who nearly lost breath, a video that refused to die in private. She does what she has practiced in boardrooms and audits. She makes a list of steps and puts them on record: suspensions, expedited review, an independent prosecutor assigned, an internal affairs task force with direct reporting. She asks for patience for the legal arc, but promises transparency that keeps process visible. Across the plaza, a cluster of men in suits murmur. Secretary Otavio Mendez is a quick statement of concern and a bureaucratic pledge, an internal inquiry, cooperation with prosecutors. His words are measured, which is to say they are written to be bendable. The governor's office issues a terse note: we support investigations, we will not tolerate misconduct. The tone is political. Ana Carolina's tone is administrative. The city is watching which of those tones will carry weight. In a side room, a small team leans over screens and evidence lists. The internal affairs agents Ana dispatched the night before have been working through the night. Lucas stands with Pedro, who is tired and pale from interviews. He watches as forensic techs duplicate the phone file. They log metadata in a way that reads like a ledger of truth. The phone's timestamp, geolocation, and the chain of custody seal are facts that do not bend easily to friendly narratives. The first break in the accused man's confidence comes not in heated argument, but in a ledger. A forensic accountant with a knack for pattern recognition takes a pile of thin bank slips and turns them into a map. Small cash deposits, irregular AGL withdrawals, transfers labeled with vague descriptions: help, expense, business. When cross-referenced with patrol logs and a private WhatsApp group that circulates between Bruno, Sergio, and Ricardo, a pattern appears. Checkpoints that coincide with routes known for unmonitored cash traffic, messages that read like instructions for improvisational extortion, photos of bundles of banknotes tucked under waistbands and behind dashboards. Bruno Valente is the first to crack in a different way. He is a man who spent years calibrating bravado to circumstance. His defense had been a confident performance intended to flatten doubt. In a small, glass-walled interview room, confronted with a printed series of messages, timestamps, locations, and receipts, his voice thins. When prosecutors read aloud a line from his own chat, "Tonight was good," the sound is more damning than any claim of motive.
He tries to laugh it off at first, then goes quiet as officers outline how the alleged traffic stop on that back road was staged, who was paid, and when. Sergio and Ricardo, who had been shadows following Bruno's lead, begin to offer versions of events that work like echoes of their leader's retreat. One recants his original bravado, the other hangs to the hope that loyalty will buy leniency. Defense counsel attempt to shift attention: procedural errors by internal affairs, chain of custody challenges, the classic strategy of washing away the clarity of a short video with long technicalities. But the metadata is a stubborn kind of witness. It tells where the phone was, when the file was created, and who touched it after. Video plume and financial paper together form a lattice that is unexpectedly hard to ignore. Outside, the media cycle spins with a force of its own. The clip is played across national morning shows. Pundits debate what the case says about police culture. Opinion piles on both sides. Some demand immediate mass reform, others urge restraint until the courts speak. Ana Carolina navigates this with the precision of someone who understands the danger of letting voice outrun evidence. She posts regular updates that are factual and short, leaving the interpretive flourish to the public and guarding the investigation from theatrical contamination.
The political actors play a more complicated game. The Secretary of Security tries to position himself as a partner in transparency, yet when offered the chance to remove certain supervisors implicated by messages found on Bruno's phone, he bristles. An aide leaks a line to a columnist implying the need for stability in the force. The governor, watching poll numbers in media heat, leans away from overt interference. For every whisper of obstruction, there is an equal and louder echo in citizens' fiends calling for clear action. In the currency of modern accountability, optics and evidence comprise a joint agitation. The prosecutor assigned to the case is a woman known for persistence. She moves quickly to request pretrial detention for Bruno. Her motion is not theatrical, it is built on the composite risk, flight, tampering with evidence, and the likelihood of repeat behavior. The judge who hears the motion weighs the argument tightly. In her decision, she speaks of the red mark, something small yet symbolically large, and of the pattern of transactions that suggests systemic abuse rather than an isolated error. Bruno is ordered to remain detained pending trial. The decision sends ripples through the precinct and through the social feeds that have now split into camps, the outraged and the skeptical. Meanwhile, Raquel feels the tug of two lives. She cannot leave the hospital bedside entirely. Her mother's breaths are fragile, a meter that oscillates unpredictably.
When Sonia opens her eyes and whispers a tired joke about the stew she will make when she gets home, Raquel laughs like a soldier who has been allowed a furlough. The military line moves to secure a transfer to a military hospital with better pulmonary care. General Alencar makes the call personally, an act of institutional solidarity that is careful not to be conflated with favoritism. He speaks of duty and of the Army's obligation to care for its own, then quietly coordinates with Ana Carolina to make sure the transfer is seamless and properly locked. Bruno learns piece by piece the cost of being exposed in a networked city. His family receives barrages of calls. A sister-in-law poses questions in the hallway with shame. His wife, Maria, sits in a cramped living room and cries into a tea towel, more for what the exposure will mean for their children than out of any sympathy for what he did. There is old anger from neighbors who had been on the receiving end of late-night checkpoints. They feel vindicated. The men Bruno used to count on begin to distance, worried for their own pensions and reputations. Investigations widen. Internal Affairs requests patrol logs going back 6 months. A district-level audit reveals other irregular checkpoints, small, almost invisible practices of extraction that had been normalized under a culture of "we fix our own." A few middle managers are implicated by phone records and quick bank movements. The prosecutor chooses to treat this as an opportunity for a broader indictment, not in rhetoric but in actual paperwork. Subpoenas go out for bank records, for WhatsApp groups across the precinct, for the supervisors who approved overtime sheets that do not match recorded patrols. What begins as a single assault blooms into a review of patterns. There are moments of raw human courage amid the bureaucracy. Pedro, who recorded the clip, testifies before a small panel and is questioned by a defense attorney who tries to paint him as sensationalist. He answers plainly, describing the scene and his impulse to record. He speaks of the difference he felt between fear and obligation, that the impulse to act was less about being a hero and more about being a neighbor who would not let a wrong go silent. Lucas accompanies him, presenting the formal chain of custody. Their testimony is quiet but precise. It is the work of citizens embedding themselves inside institutions long enough to make them act. Public pressure remains a constant force. Protesters gather at the plaza, some to demand harsher punishment, others to call for systemic reform. A nonprofit watchdog begins to compile an interactive map of alleged abuse points across the city, inviting citizens to submit their experiences. The mayor's office, sensing the political current, schedules a community hearing.
Ana Carolina attends and speaks plainly about limits. She can act within the law and her remit, but real change will require cooperation from the governor's office, legislative projects, and a culture of reporting that protects honest officers who come forward. Conversations turn to practical reforms that will have immediate symbolic and material effect: mandatory body-worn cameras on patrol, an anonymous complaint hotline managed by a third-party nonprofit, mandatory rotations for units to reduce the ossification of extortion networks, and stronger auditing of petty cash and overtime. Skeptics point to budget constraints and the glass of small reforms as insufficient. Advocates push back, saying partial remedies are better than none. Ana Carolina frames this as a beginning, a pilot, a transparency index, a public dashboard showing complaint resolution times. She often repeats a line from the press podium: "We can begin to rebuild trust by making abuse visible, not as a cure-all, but as a guiding principle." As the legal calendar advances, the arraignment becomes a stage for public theater. Bruno appears, eyes downcast, flanked by counsel. Serrated questions from local columnists: was this a systemic pattern? Was there a broader network? Hang in the air. The defense suggests procedural mistakes in the seizure of evidence. The prosecution cites the careful logs Lucas and Internal Affairs maintained. The judge rules that the case will proceed and sets a provisional trial date. The decision is both procedural and symbolic. It states that the city will not sweep the episode under a rug of quiet settlements. Trial days are long and spare, built of small, revealing moments. Witnesses speak, their testimonies apparently inconsequential when uttered singly, but collectively forming a chorus of corroboration. A patrol supervisor testified that he had received messages requesting help from certain officers. A bank teller speaks to repeated withdrawals that match the detritus of extortion payments. A colleague admits to discomfort at past collections and details attempts to stop the practice. Raquel walks through the courtroom with deliberate dignity. She answers questions about the night without excess. Sonia's testimony is thin but devastating, a mother's recounting of the breath she couldn't find and the nights she lay awake fearing silence. The defense tries to puncture the credibility of cell phone evidence to suggest tampering. A forensic analyst counters, explaining the data in a way that is technical but clear, and in this courtroom clarity matters more than flourish. When asked, the analyst shows a map of locations tied to messages and deposits. The pattern is hard to dismiss. Public attention is fierce, but the court remains methodical, refusing the velocity of outrage and insisting on the slumber logic of rules. Verdict day arrives with a gravity that is nearly medical. The judge reads the conclusions, guilty of assault and abuse of authority.
Sentencing, however, is a negotiation of law and discretion. Bruno receives a custodial sentence. Sergio and Ricardo receive mixed outcomes, suspended sentences and administrative expulsions for some, convictions for others, depending on their level of cooperation. The sentences are not a cinematic vanquishing of corruption. They are a legal outcome, measured and imperfect, that carries with it the force of precedent. Ana Catalina does not celebrate. She receives the news at a small hospital room where Sonia has been making steady, if fragile, progress. Recovery is not neat. Sonia spends a week in a respiratory unit where nurses whisper of recovery curves and incremental victories. The first time she walks down a hospital corridor with less assistance, Raquel squeezes her hand like a prayer. There are small humiliations in healing, a cough that arrives unexpectedly, a burst of fatigue that unmakes plans for a day, but there are also times when the three of them laugh at the ridiculousness of being institutionally famous for having a family meal get interrupted by state action. Homecoming is humble. The apartment is the same small space that once held two girls with thrifted uniforms. Sonia notices the patch of sun on the floor that has not moved. Friends and neighbors bring food. The smell of stew and goodwill fills a kitchen that has spent the last weeks as an operating room of anxiety. The sisters, still in regulation, remove their outer layers and get to work in a way that feels defiantly ordinary. They clean the small Honda Bis. The motorcycle is a minuscule reliquary, a vehicle that carried groceries, and now, symbolically, a battered dignity. They wash the dust away, not out of sentimentality, but because ritual of care is a reclaiming. For the meal, they make bobo de camarón, an old favorite, a tender stew of shrimp and cassava that is both lush and practical. The recipe is Sonia's, browned by years of hands that know heat and timing. The dish steams gently, and for a few hours the family returns to the simple contract of sharing food and stories. They talk about the trial in small, circumspect fragments, what went right, what was missing. They talk about the reforms in a more practical tone, the hotline, body cams, the pilot programs in select precincts. They speak about the future with the kind of modest hope that has teeth. It's not unquestioning optimism, but a belief that action, however slow, may bend institutions toward accountability. Elsewhere in the city, the initial heat of the scandal forces some structural response. The department approves an emergency allocation for body-worn cameras in key districts. An anonymous complaint platform is contracted with a civic NGO to manage intake and vetting. Internal Affairs expands its audit unit and receives training in digital forensics. These are bureaucratic moves, paperwork, and line items, but they matter because they set new expectations. The union representing officers reluctantly agrees to a pilot training program on ethics and public engagement. There is grumbling. There are real complaints about cost and scope. But the small material changes begin to build a scaffolding that makes certain abuses harder to hide. Resistance persists. Some officers resent what they call political theater. Old habits die slowly. There are whispered rumors of backlash, retaliation against complainants, slowness in some precincts to hand over tapes. Ana Carolina knows the danger. Reform is not a single act, but a sustained campaign that requires legal safeguards, civic pressure, and internal cultural shifts. She moves deliberately, asking for public audits of the rollout and independent oversight of the complaint platform. Her insistence on transparency makes enemies and allies in equal measure. The men who had once chuckled at the roadside find their lives altered in ways that are practical and painful. Bruno, in custody, receives letters from his 2 children and a terse call from a father who cannot explain. He watches the news from a distance, recognizing the public friction he has caused. There is no grand contrition. Sometimes there is only the thinness of a man who discovered that impunity is a fragile illusion when it collides with an ordered legal response and a phone in a stranger's hand. Months later, at a civic hearing, Anna Carolina speaks not as a victor, but as a steward. She reads improvement metrics, complaint response times down by 30% in piloted precincts, camera adoption in 27 patrol units, and an initial uptick in reports from officers who now feel they can blow the whistle without immediate retribution. She frames these numbers not as a finish line, but as an account book, progress documented, but lines still to be balanced. The trial's political reverberations are uneven. The Secretary of Security finds himself answering questions about managerial oversight. The governor's office funds a legislative study into patrol practices across the state. Some local politicians call for further hearings. Some want to use the episode as leverage. A few institutional actors push for deeper structural reforms, civilian oversight boards with subpoena power, mandatory financial disclosures for officers in certain roles. These proposals face resistance and will take time. The city, hospitable to inertia, moves in increments. Back in the apartment, the family stitches back routine. Sonia sits by the window, and bottles of medication line a neat shelf. Raquel starts to return to military duty in a constrained way, administrative tasks, mentoring younger officers, public talks about resilience. Anna Carolina returns to policy meetings, but with an altered focus. She is less disposed to turf protections and more intent on extracting civic wins, transparent complaint handling, community policing models that prioritize presence over extraction.
They teach the younger neighbors a small lesson: speak up and record. But they also teach something else, that institutions can be asked to do better if citizens provide evidence and persistence, and if leaders, however imperfect, choose to act within the law. The sisters hold a small community meeting in their block where neighbors come and share stories of checkpoints and small humiliations. Some speak of bribes paid to keep trucks moving, of men waved through near-empty streets because their banners promised help. Their stories cross the radar of local NGOs who begin to compile data for a wider civic campaign. For a time, the family's name is public currency, a mixed blessing. The sisters accept it as a cost of catalyzing change. They understand that the price of spotlight is perpetual scrutiny. They also note the gift: neighbors who now feel empowered to report misbehavior, and a city now starting to tally its wrongs. There are, however, somber aftershocks. A few officers, honest among them, express resentment at being broadly tarred by the scandal. They argue for nuance and for the public to understand that most officers do not extort. Anna Carolina addresses this often, insisting that the movement is not against policing as a profession, but against a culture of abuse within it. She meets with rank-and-file officers, listens to their concerns, and pushes for internal mechanisms that reward officers who report corruption. It is slow work, requiring patience, and the balancing of competing institutional claims. By the time the first anniversary of the slap arrives, the city has logged both gains and lacunae. The complaint line that was promised exists, and it has processed hundreds of reports, a portion of which have led to further inquiries. The pilot body camera program, after early technical snafus, now runs on a protocol that limits tampering. Yet budget constraints mean expansion is partial. Some districts remain unmonitored. The culture that allowed impunity has not vanished. It has been forced into daylight and will require continued attention to keep it contained. Anna Carolina drives by the road where it happened once, the checkpoint another kind of history. The asphalt is patched in a few places. The light catches the same dust. She does not feel triumphant. She feels accountable to a ledger of promises she knows she must keep. She thinks of the red mark that once cut an evening into a before and after, and of the way a single citizen's phone can tilt a city's attention. At home, Sonia sets a small jar of pickled peppers on the table. The sisters ladle bobo into bowls and eat like people aware of the small happiness of ordinary meals. They talk about the future in a voice less public than before, less concerned with headlines, and more concerned with what will live when the cameras go. They make plans for a neighborhood clinic fundraiser and discuss training sessions for youth about civic rights and responsibilities.
In the epilogue months later, the legal outcomes remain real but not redemptive. Bruno serves his sentence. Sergio and Ricardo face administrative consequences that end their careers in the force. Several mid-level supervisors are suspended pending further review. Reforms, body cameras, complaint platforms, independent audits have begun, but their permanence is not guaranteed. The cultural work, teaching neighbor to speak and system to listen, continues. Ana Carolina keeps her office door open in a way she once did not. It is symbolic but meaningful. Citizens come with complaints, with offers of help, with stories. She listens and she acts where she can. She knows the limits of her power and the necessity of sustained civic engagement. She speaks at community gatherings about dignity and restraint, about how the arc of accountability is not a straight path, but a series of linked choices. The family's bobo simmered into memory, but the pot remains as a reminder. Ordinary things are both fragile and worth protecting. The Honda Biz, polished and parked, becomes an emblem of small endurance. Every scratch tells a story, and every polished chrome a choice to keep living. The city, in the end, keeps both the bite of scandal and the work of repair. Newspapers run retrospective pieces that catalog what changed and what didn't. Reform advocates score wins but also register the steady resistance of institutional habit. The sisters, who found in their private pain a public lever, dim their interview lights but keep their vigilance sharp. When Ana Carolina walks through a neighborhood outreach program months later, a young woman approaches her and says simply, "I saw your speech. You made me feel I could report without being erased." It is a small compliment, the sort of thing that fuels quiet institutional change. Ana Carolina replies in a voice that is not victorious but grateful, telling the woman that speaking out is part of citizenship and that institutions must be held to their word. The final image is domestic and restraint. The three women sit at a small table, a bowl of bobo between them, the afternoon sun warming a slice of the room. They are quieter now, habit and endurance stitched into their faces. They speak of ordinary plans, an upcoming market trip, a doctor's appointment, a nephew's first exam. The city continues to churn around them, indifferent and vivid, full of needed reforms and recalcitrant problems. Justice in this story took its time and left its marks. It was formalized in courtrooms and practical in policies, but its depth will be measured over years by how often ordinary citizens feel safe and how equitably institutions respond when they are wronged. The slap, brutal and immediate, became a catalyst because a citizen refused to let it stay a secret, because a chief of police chose procedure over spectacle, because a family anchored its public pain in patient work.
If you watch this through to the end, think about your city for a moment. Where would you be if you saw a wrong happen in plain sight? Tell us where you're watching from and what you would change in your city's police culture. Share this story to keep the conversation alive.